All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. So thank you all for coming. For those of you who are med students here at Mizzou, you guys can get your MedZoo credit for this. So just scan the QR code and you can get your credits. Let me know if you need me to put this back up at the end, and I can do that. So I guess real quick, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. All right, let me get my laser pointer. We got that, and we are ready. Okay, so again, thank you all for coming. Again, thank you to the med students. I'm excited to have some of you here tonight. I'm going to share with you the title of my talk, which is Understanding the Genius of the Body. And this is part of what we have as our Genius of the Body series. So I'm going to take a minute before I go into this talk and explain to you what our Genius of the Body series is. So we started this series last year in the beginning of 2023. And the way this series works is we have 2 seminars a semester, so 2 in the spring and 2 in the fall. And the goals of this series, as you can see up here, are really to educate the general population, to provide a deeper understanding of your reproductive health care and fertility. So that you can appreciate the design of your bodies and how your anatomy, hormones, and physiology work together. And then how you can understand your body to work with it to achieve fertility goals, or in the case of those who are not seeking fertility, to manage other aspects of their reproductive health. Also, we want to empower men and women by educating them in this way to advocate for their reproductive health care. So a deeper understanding of your body will give you the knowledge and help you to make informed decisions that align with your goals and beliefs. And ultimately, we want to foster a relationship with local and campus healthcare. That's why we're excited to be here on campus giving this talk. And we want to be able to provide resources and support for alternative methods for fertility care and reproductive care on the whole. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try to cover a really broad topic, which is reproductive biology. So I'm going to talk about female reproductive anatomy and function, spend a little bit of time talking about the menstrual cycle and hormones, and how we can use the menstrual cycle as an indicator of overall female health. And then we're going to talk a little bit about hormonal contraceptives, some of their physiological effects, and some considerations that we often overlook. Then we'll talk about male reproductive anatomy because guys are involved in this too. And we're going to talk about their reproductive function, as well as newer research that is starting to help us understand how we can use male reproductive health as biomarkers or indicators for general male health, just like we do as the menstrual cycle in women for general female health. And then lastly, I'm going to put it all together and talk briefly about early pregnancy and the beginning of life. So jumping right into female anatomy. So we're going to go through all of these organs, starting with the ovary, the innermost organ, fallopian tubes, the uterus, cervix, and vagina, and talk about what their functions are and how hormones regulate them. So starting off with the ovary, depicted in this cartoon diagram here, is about the size of your thumb. It contains 2 primary structures. The first are fluid-filled follicles, and these follicles contain a single egg. The other structure is the corpus luteum, and this is what the follicle turns into after that follicle ovulates an egg. And then this entire ovary is coddled by this fallopian tube here, particularly these little finger-like projections called the fimbriae. So the function of the ovary, 2 primary functions. The first is to produce a mature egg, which is the female gamete. And interestingly, some may know or not know that women, female species in general, are born with the lifetime supply of eggs that they'll ever have. And so once a woman is born, they will no longer produce any more eggs. Whatever they have is it from then on out. And we'll talk about how that leads to menopause. The other thing that the ovary does is produces hormones, predominantly estrogen and progesterone. So there's some other ones, but these are the ones that we're going to talk about today. So estrogen is made by that follicle structure that has the egg in it, and then progesterone is made by that CL, the corpus luteum, which is what the follicle turns into. And these hormones are what regulate the reproductive cycles of women, and then not so much men, but men have a daily or hourly cycles, you could say. We'll get to that. But they also play a huge role in regulating the function of other reproductive organs, so like the uterus, for example. So if we're looking at the ovary, just to kind of visualize these changes that the ovary goes through. So the top portion here is showing the follicles. And so the ovary goes through a follicular cycle that corresponds to the menstrual cycle in women. So there's 2 phases of the menstrual cycle we'll see. There's also 2 phases of the ovary or follicular cycle. So the first phase is called the follicular phase, where we have follicles that are growing. And the first follicles that grow are called primordial follicles. And these are dormant, and these are the ones where all of our lifetime supply of eggs are contained in the ovary. So what happens, and we refer to this as our follicular reserve. And so what happens each cycle is that a number of these primordial follicles are recruited to grow. And so they'll grow in size as depicted in this cartoon here. And one of them will be selected to become the dominant follicle. And that's the one that's going to ovulate. As we know, women only ovulate 1 egg or 1 follicle per month. And so many of them grow up, but only one of them will actually ovulate. So all of those other follicles that started to grow up will undergo what's called atresia or follicular death. And so we end up with a lot of follicles that end up dying versus ovulating. And then, as I said before, after ovulation, that empty follicle turns into the corpus luteum. And so speaking about the follicular reserve that I mentioned, and the fact that many follicles are grown every month, but only one ovulates, and most of them die, what that means is that if we start out with our lifetime supply at birth, which is about 1 million follicles, by the time a girl hits puberty, she's down to about 300,000 follicles. And then during this period of time where there's menstrual cycles occurring, there's a rapid decrease in the remaining follicles that are left. And this is because every cycle, the majority of the follicles that are called up to grow actually die. And again, only one ovulates. And then as that lifetime reserve is depleted, around age 50 is when we get down to around 1,000 follicles or eggs left, and that's when a woman enters menopause. And so that's why she enters menopause, is because she has depleted all of her eggs. Okay, so moving on from the ovary, we have the fallopian tube. So this is the structure that is basically going to catch the ovulated egg. And so we talk about it as a catcher's mitt. So it just kind of surrounds the ovary, and when the egg is ovulated, it will catch that egg. This tube is about 4 to 5 inches long, and it connects from that ovary to the uterus. Other functions of the fallopian tube, this is where sperm is transported to meet the egg. So once the egg is ovulated, it moves into the center of the fallopian tube. The sperm will encounter it in the middle of the fallopian tube, and that's where fertilization happens. And then that fallopian tube helps transport that developing embryo out of the fallopian tube and into the uterus. So we've got a lot of transport going on. So now once we get to the uterus, so that is this large structure here. It's about the size of your fist, and it's pear-shaped. It's a hollow, heavily muscular structure, so this light pink here, that's all muscle. And there's 2 main layers. There's that muscle layer, and then there's this inner layer, which is called the endometrium. And the endometrium is what sheds every month during menstruation. So the function of the uterus, some things we don't tend to think about is the uterus plays a big role in actually transporting sperm to the fallopian tube. So sperm swim a little bit, but they actually don't make it to the fallopian tube by just swimming. There's muscle contractions in the uterus that help move the sperm to the fallopian tube. Once the fertilized egg, now an embryo, leaves the fallopian tube and enters the uterus, this is now where embryo and fetal growth will occur. So that is the first point of contact with the embryo, and then where the fetus will develop. And then, of course, the uterus plays a big role in actually giving birth, which is called parturition. So the last two structures are going to be the cervix and vagina. So this is the cervix here. This structure is very short and muscular, and it's highly folded, and it has mucous membranes with crypts in it. So I'll explain why this matters. So first of all, one of its primary functions is a barrier. So the entire female reproductive tract, all the way into the peritoneal cavity, is technically open to the external environment. So it's an entire tube structure all the way to that open fallopian tube into the peritoneal cavity. This here is the only true barrier to the external environment. So this plays a big role in preventing infections, and it's also what keeps a baby inside the mom when she's pregnant. Other important things that the cervix does is it's going to produce a mucus, which is important for sperm entrance into the uterus. Or it's going to produce mucus that prevents sperm entrance into the uterus. So depending, and we'll see this in a little bit, depending on what stage of the menstrual cycle, the mucus that the cervix produces will either promote sperm entrance into the uterus, or it will prevent sperm entrance into the uterus. And then the vagina, the last structure, it's a muscular canal, which has a mucus lining, and its function is the copulatory organ. It serves to provide lubrication and protection during copulation, and then it's the birth canal. Okay, so we've got the organs down, so now we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle and how hormones work and regulate those organs. So a little bit about the menstrual cycle. So it is cyclic changes, meaning monthly changes in the reproductive organs that I just described due to hormones. And the word menses, which we will use the term menses for menstruation, so we use those interchangeably, and menses comes from the Latin word for month. And then originally, the menstrual cycle was thought to be regulated by the lunar cycle, and it actually led to these ideas of cyclic lunacy or hysteria, and that's where we get the term hysterectomy from, which is removal of the uterus. Hysterectomy, so removal of the thing that causes hysteria. So that's historically how we perceived the menstrual cycle. So this is what the menstrual cycle looks like. I'll take you through each one of these. So we have some high up brain hormones that regulate everything downstream. And these come from the pituitary, and they regulate really when ovulation is going to happen. And that's this LH hormone here. This is the ovarian cycle that I talked about. So this is the follicle growing. So the primordial follicle, and it grows up and becomes dominant, and then it ovulates and then makes the corpus luteum. The follicle, as I said, produces estrogen. So we can see how estrogen rises across the month, and then it starts to drop, and the corpus luteum is formed, and it starts to produce progesterone. And then when we look at the uterus, which is the most downstream thing that is regulated in the menstrual cycle, we see a lot of changes that happen in the uterine lining, which is the endometrium. And so we have a couple of phases. We have the menstrual phase, which is where there's shedding of the uterine lining. And then we have this, what's called the proliferative phase. That's where that tissue regrows or regenerates. That's actually what I study in my research, is how this tissue regrows properly. And then we enter the secretory phase, which is where we get this tissue becomes specialized, and it becomes specialized to support a pregnancy. If there's no pregnancy, then progesterone levels drop, and that causes this tissue that grew to shed, and we enter menstruation again. And then we do it all again. Okay, so this is the overall menstrual cycle. So keep in mind, follicle, estrogen, growth, corpus luteum, progesterone, pregnancy. I'm going to test you on a little bit.
All right, so a little bit more about hormones. So I really like this. I teach a reproductive physiology course for graduate students, and this always gets the students. So this is a picture of an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and this is a picture of me holding a fourth of a teaspoon of sugar, but it's actually half full, so it's an eighth of a teaspoon, and I didn't have an eighth of a teaspoon. So what I'm showing you here is if you were to dump that eighth of a teaspoon of sugar into that Olympic-sized swimming pool, that is equivalent to the highest concentration of estrogen in a woman during her menstrual cycle. So that tiny little bit of hormone, the sugar, is enough to do everything that I'm going to tell you in the next couple of slides, that small, tiny amount. So keep in mind, a little bit has a great effect. Okay, so what do these hormones do? So starting in that follicular phase, we're growing follicles, producing estrogen, and the uterus is growing. So what does estrogen do? So starting at the brain, because everything in reproduction is controlled by the brain, so estrogen actually talks to the brain. So estrogen can may increase serotonin activity and cognition. That's why women tend to be a little happier and more alert and cognitive when they're in that phase of the cycle. It leads to breast tissue growth. For the ovary, as the follicles are growing, they're making the estrogen, but that estrogen also actually itself makes those follicles grow. So they kind of feed on each other. And then estrogen is actually what also feeds up to the brain and tells it to make the hormone LH, which causes ovulation. When we look at the fallopian tube, estrogen is going to cause fluid production and muscle contractions, and this helps with that transport of the sperm and egg so that they can meet, and then embryo transport out. In the uterus, remember it's going to cause this growth that I talked about here, so high estrogen, and we get growth that's occurring. And then it also causes muscle contractions of the uterus for sperm transport, so it can meet the egg in the fallopian tube. And then for the cervix, it's the hormone that produces or that causes the production of the mucus that allows sperm to enter the cervix. So some of the things, a little more about what estrogen does to the cervix. So when it's before ovulation, so low estrogen levels, there's going to be a very closed and tight cervix, and the mucus is going to be very thick and viscous, and so sperm won't be able to enter very well. At the time of ovulation, when we have the highest estrogen levels, it causes the cervix to relax and open, and then the mucus becomes very viscous, and so that supports sperm transport into the uterus. And then again, after ovulation, estrogen is going to go down, and the cervix is going to tighten up again. Remember, now we're going to prepare the uterus for pregnancy, and so the cervix is going to prepare for pregnancy too. So it's going to tighten up in case there's a fetus to keep inside. All right, and the last thing is down to the vagina, and it also affects mucus production in the vagina for protection, and then it also changes the cells that are present in the vagina. So this is showing, just like we see in the uterus where it thickens, the cell layers of the vagina also thicken, and this is for protection. All right, so estrogen has risen, ovulation has occurred, and now progesterone is going to be produced. So now we're going to get preparation for pregnancy. So progesterone means progestation, so it's the progestational hormone. So in the brain, it may impair memory and increase negative mood. This is why oftentimes women who are approaching their stage of menses when progesterone is getting high, so these few days before menstruation is going to occur, women can become more irritable. And this is also thought to be why there are the experiences of like pregnancy brain during pregnancy because of high progesterone levels, possibly impairing brain memory and cognition. In the breast, it's going to stimulate formation of milk glands, which can result in swelling and soreness. And this is, again, preparing for the potential of pregnancy. The ovary, so the follicle has stopped growing. It's turned into the corpus luteum, and now the corpus luteum is what is producing that progesterone. In the fallopian tube, it's going to slow those contractions and movement so that the embryo can kind of slowly make its way into the uterus, as opposed to being slammed around in the fallopian tube. Once it gets into the uterus, if there is an embryo, what progesterone does in the uterus is it's going to stop the thickening, and now it's going to cause this tissue to become specialized for pregnancy. And then it's also going to stop any myometrial contractions or muscle contractions of the uterus. And this is so that the uterus is very stable and quiet and a nice resting environment for that embryo to grow into a fetus. The cervix, as I said, it's going to thicken, the mucus is going to thicken and the cervix is going to tighten. So to this stage here, so after ovulation, tightened cervix, thick mucus. And so now we have completed the progesterone stage. At the end of this period of time, this corpus luteum is going to regress if there's no pregnancy. And if that's not there, it can't make progesterone. Progesterone drops, and that drop in progesterone is what causes the shedding of the uterine lining. And then we start all over again. So menstruation is a pretty unique phenomenon. It only happens in very few species, so a few primates, including humans, the elephant shrew, the fruit bat, and, oh no, wait, that's the elephant shrew down there. This is the spiny mouse, and this is a species of fruit bat. So only really 4 categories of animals that we know menstruate. So as I said, it occurs monthly, and it's caused by loss of progesterone. So if there's no embryo to signal that it's there, then that corpus luteum will die, and it will stop producing progesterone, and we get menstruation. And so I'm going to read this quote here because I think this is kind of interesting, and it really speaks to the way that I think about menstruation and how we should really be paying more attention to it. So sure, this comes from George W. Corner, who in my field we kind of think of as like the grandfather of studying hormones in menstruation. And so this is from 1942, so it's a fun quote. It says, "Surely the process of menstruation is one of the strangest things in all nature. An important organ, the uterus, serving an indispensable function, is overtaken at regular intervals by a destructive change in the structure of its lining, part of which undergoes dissolution with hemorrhage and must be reorganized in every monthly cycle. The loss of blood from organic tissues everywhere else in the animal kingdom, a sign of injury, even of danger, is in this organ the evidence of healthy function." So if the uterus isn't menstruating, we'll get to a caveat to this. If you are just being completely natural and you are not menstruating, it can be an indicator of overall issues with your health. And this was recognized in 1942 that the uterus needs to menstruate to be considered a normally functioning organ. And we now know that it's an indicator of overall health. So just real quick, what does this kind of look like? So this is looking at histology of the uterus. So this thick layer down here is the muscle, and this kind of thinner layer up here is the endometrium that grows and sheds. So this is as it's in the early growth phase. This is after it has completed growth, so you can see how large it has grown. It actually grows from about 5, you guys can't see that well, but 5 millimeters to anywhere from 11 to 15 millimeters every month. So that's a huge tissue growth. And then again, if there's no pregnancy, the whole purpose of that tissue is to support a pregnancy. So if there isn't one, then it sheds. And so that's what's happening here, is this disorganization and shedding of that tissue. So I've been kind of alluding to this. We tend to think, or we're in my research field starting to realize that menstruation should be thought of as one of the 5th vital signs. So what we mean by that is that menstrual irregularities can indicate many different issues. It can indicate very straightforward hormonal imbalances. So if estrogen and progesterone are off, then your menstrual cycle will be off. It can also be an indicator of gynecological diseases. So a lot of gynecological diseases, their symptoms are changes or disruptions in the menstrual cycle. And it can also be an indication of infection. So again, changes in the menstrual cycle indicating an issue. Stress can change the menstrual cycle, changes in weight or diet, certain medications, and then lifestyle factors. These can all either temporarily change or disrupt or stop the menstrual cycle. One of the biggest examples of stress, or could be a combination of stress and change in weight or diet, is high-performing athletes when they oftentimes will stop menstruating because they're putting so much stress on their body. What this means to us is that the reproductive system not being a vital system for my individual life. So what that means is if I lose my heart, I die. If I lose my uterus, I don't die. So any time that our body is experiencing stress, it's going to start to divert away from less essential functions, and a less essential function would be reproduction for the individual's life. What's kind of funny, or I don't know if I could say ironic about that, is that reproduction may not be essential for my life, but it's essential for the human species' life. So without it, the human species does not continue. We also know recently there was a big study, actually several studies, that demonstrated that there were menstrual cycle changes in women who received the COVID-19 vaccine. And so what this indicated to us is that we needed to take the menstrual cycle into consideration when we're doing clinical trials on outcomes and effects that are experienced by people who are in these trials, so that when women, an example of where this becomes a big issue is some of the women who experienced changes in their menstrual cycle were actually women who were postmenopausal, and they actually started menstruating again due to this vaccine. Now, the problem with that is that postmenopausal bleeding is one of the #1 indicators of endometrial cancer. And so these women have this postmenstrual bleeding, and then they freak out and go to their doctor, and the doctor's like, oh no, we have to do a cancer screen. And it's really just because we didn't know that this vaccine could cause these changes. So what this tells us is that we really need to take this into consideration more. Okay, so just kind of continuing on with this a little bit, thinking about the menstrual cycle, and if it's going to be an indicator of health, we have to understand how we can track it. And so what this is a chart displaying how we can use cervical mucus. Remember, I told you how it changes in terms of its viscosity depending on what stage of the menstrual cycle you're in. So if women monitor their cervical mucus, which is actually really easy to do, based off of its consistency, it very nicely aligns with the hormone profiles of estrogen and progesterone. So what that means is that we can use cervical mucus to track our cycle and understand if we are cycling normally. So just to walk us through this, we have red dots here indicate days of bleeding. Green indicate that there is no mucus. The little baby-looking stickers indicate that there is viscous mucus, the type that would be seen during the fertile stage or high estrogen, and then they enter back into that dry stage, and then there would be bleeding after that. And if we look at the hormones, this is estrogen in the black bars, and we can see it increases nicely when we have that nice viscous mucus that is present because of that estrogen. And then the red is progesterone, and it aligns nicely with that dry spell after the viscous stage. The other thing that this charting can do is allow people who are trained to read these charts to determine issues. So in this stage, or this cycle tracking was in a person who was infertile. This is cycle tracking for a miscarriage. cycle tracking for low progesterone, and then abnormal bleeding. And so this can help doctors understand, and the women themselves understand what may be going on in their cycle. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about hormonal contraceptives. So I just told you how important it is how our menstrual cycle can give us an indication of our overall health. So I'm going to talk about hormonal contraceptives and how that can be problematic if we're trying to use the menstrual cycle to monitor our overall health, as well as some other considerations. So I have not listed all the types of contraceptives here. These are just hormonal and the primary kinds that are available. So the main times are going to be combined estrogen and progestin oral contraceptives. So these are the pill. There's progestin only, and these are typically a pill, or they're going to be an implant or an IUD, and there are also vaginal rings and patches. Okay, so what does it look like hormonally when we take these birth controls? So this is the normal cycle. There's our high estrogen, and then in the blue is the progesterone coming up. And so this is 3 cycles shown here. The combined hormonal contraception, this is a general schematic of how that goes. It's a high level of combined synthetic estrogen and progesterone. So it just maintains this high level. And then for the progestin only, whether it's a pill or an implant or IUD, it is a high level of synthetic progestins. So what we're seeing here is there's no estrogen stimulation in this case, and in here the only estrogen stimulation is this synthetic estrogen. And so we'll see what this can actually do. Before that, how they work. So 3 primary ways that they work is to prevent ovulation, thicken cervical mucus to prevent sperm from entering, and reducing the endometrial growth, which becomes problematic for pregnancy. So why do women take contraceptives? The primary reason, pregnancy prevention, but there's other reasons why women are prescribed hormonal contraceptives, being menstrual cycle regulation or reducing menstrual pain, to try and treat acne, to treat symptoms of gynecological diseases, and then to treat premenstrual disorder. So what are the benefits that we often hear about of hormonal contraceptives? So we usually talk about how it regulates the menstrual cycle. Well, it does this in a couple of ways. So when we talk about issues with the menstrual cycle, we think about prolonged and heavy bleeding. So what hormonal contraceptives do is they reduce that endometrial growth. So if there's not as much endometrium, there's not as much to shed. So the bleeding won't be as heavy and it won't be as long. It creates consistency in the timing of bleeding, or it stops bleeding altogether. So consistency would be in the combined ones where you have progesterone that is dropped off, so you know that you're going to menstruate at this period of time. Or with high progesterone, you stop menstruation altogether. There's a lot of talk about how hormonal contraceptives reduce the risk of ovarian and uterine cancer. This is mainly due to decreasing the overall lifetime activity of estrogen. So these cancers grow due to estrogen activity. So if you are in a progestin only, suppressing estrogen for a very long time, you reduce the overall lifetime exposure and risk of these cancers. And then they're used to treat uterine fibroids, for example. That's really because of these menstrual symptoms associated with fibroids. So you're not actually treating the fibroid, you're treating the symptom associated with the fibroid. And then, did I put that in there twice? No, reduced risk of uterine, yeah, I put that in twice. Okay. Well, what I'd like to say, though, is that what hormonal contraception does in all of these cases is it suppresses the normal cycle of hormones, and it will either, one, mask any symptoms that are there, or it's basically, it's putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms. So you're not actually targeting the root cause of these conditions. So uterine cancer, for example, if it's because there's too much estrogen exposure, that's probably because there's an issue with ovarian function. So maybe we should address ovarian function instead of just ramming the system with progestins and shutting everything down. So getting to the root cause of what is causing the cancer as opposed to just shutting down the hormonal system to try and prevent cancer. So there are also a lot of potential risky side effects with birth control, and a lot of these we're familiar with. So weight loss or gain, fatigue, bloating, it's not up here, but thrombosis is a common one. Some of the ones that we typically don't talk about are going to be the ones that we just talked about as being benefits. So you can see cancer listed up here. So I just told you how taking birth control might be protective against uterine and ovarian cancer, but we know from research that it actually is a risk factor for developing cervical and breast cancer. So taking that into consideration. Things that we also don't talk about are going to be yeast infections or vaginal dryness. So estrogen is what causes vaginal mucus. If it's a progestin-only pill, then that causes vaginal dryness. So there's a lot of side effects that we don't really talk about all that much in terms of taking hormonal contraceptives. A couple of other things that I think are really important that we don't talk about is the fact that hormonal contraceptives are supraphysiological doses of synthetic hormones. So what does this mean? This means that these hormones, being synthetic, are not the same as the hormones we have in our body. So although we have a good understanding of how they work, we know that there are many ways that they act that we don't understand. And that's why we get all of those side effects, because we don't fully understand how they act. The other problem is that a lot of these hormones are actually excreted because they're taken at such high doses, and they end up in the water supplies. There's research out there, many countries, showing some of the most prominent synthetic hormones and contraceptives in water supplies. And so the problem with that is that these hormones are what we call in my research field endocrine disruptors. So what that does is it disrupts your hormone signaling networks. And importantly, it impairs the development of male and female reproductive organs properly. So it impacts overall development. And then another issue is that some of the progesterone components of these hormonal contraceptives actually, because again they're synthetic, actually have a testosterone-like activity. So a lot of our hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, are very similar in shape. And so when we start messing with them and manipulating them, we can actually make them more similar to other ones. So if we have progesterone acting like testosterone, that's going to be problematic. And then something else that we don't often talk about is the effects on reproductive function. And so this is just one that I want to talk about. What are the effects on fertility? So one of the questions that is often asked is, if a woman takes hormonal contraceptives for a long period of time or even a short period of time, what's her likelihood of being able to have children after that? And usually we hear it's pretty good. And I'll explain why we just need to think about this a little more. So this is a study where they looked at different types of hormonal contraceptives, implants, and oral contraceptives. And then they looked at the women and determined within a year after them stopping hormonal contraceptives how many were pregnant. So they showed that the average of women that had stopped using implants, 74.4% on average were pregnant within a year after taking them. So we're like, okay, yay, that's great. But if you actually look at the data and you look at the range is 37.5 to 90%. So it's a huge range. This is an average. Sometimes a large number of women weren't able to get pregnant within 12 months after stopping contraceptives. And so if we actually look at the non-pregnant range, 25.3% on average didn't get pregnant. that's 1 in 4 women weren't able to get pregnant after stopping contraceptives. And the range is 10 to 62.5. And we see similar outcomes with the oral contraceptives. So this is just a cautionary tale of when you hear that, oh, you stop hormonal contraceptives, everything's great, fertility is fine, just know that there are ranges and averages out there that don't actually encompass what women are actually experiencing. Okay, so last thing on that for consideration. So if menstruation is the 5th vital sign, then disrupting the normal menstrual cycle with contraceptives can mask illness or disease. I put an example up here, premature ovarian failure. If we cannot monitor particular hormone levels that change during the menstrual cycle, we can mask premature ovarian failure. And so a woman may be taking contraceptives for 10 years, get off of them and think, okay, great, I'm going to get pregnant, but she realizes during that period of time, she was actually experiencing premature ovarian failure, and so she's actually not very fertile. And then the other thing, as I said, is that oral contraceptives do not treat the underlying cause of gynecological or other diseases or disorders. It just Band-Aids them.
Call from.
Okay, we're going to just keep going. So this is males. So guys, I've got stuff for you to know as well. So the primary organs are the testes, the vas deferens here, the seminal vesicles, prostate, and then the penis. So I put this image up here. As I said, I teach a graduate reproductive physiology course, and I really like this because this comes from a textbook that describes the male reproductive system as a manufacturing complex. And not to diminish what guys are doing, because you'll see in a few minutes that you are very active even when you don't know that you are. So it's a very efficient process. So what we have in the testes, this is what we call the manufacturing plant. So this is where sperm is made. It makes sperm and they make testosterone. So testosterone being the primary hormone in men. And the plant must be air conditioned. So this is why testes are housed outside of the body cavity and they're in the scrotum, is because they need to be air conditioned, and that is important for sperm production. So the epididymis is what we call the finishing shop. It's a little structure that surrounds the testis right here. And this is where sperm is matured and becomes or gains the ability to fertilize an egg. And then in a particular spot in the epididymis is where sperm is stored until ejaculation. The vas deferens is this structure, oh, where is it? Right here. That leads up into the body cavity. What this structure does is it's the transport, so it's the shipping company, and it transports sperm from the epididymis up into the body cavity, past the prostate, and then down through the penis. The prostate, located up in this area in the body cavity, is what makes the volume of an ejaculate. So it produces seminal fluid. And then after passing through the prostate, then the now ejaculate will continue down through the urethra and through the penis. So a little bit more about the testes. So I told you, or actually we'll get to that in a second. So I told you that you guys are doing a lot even as you're sitting there. So women, as I said, have a lifetime supply of eggs when they're born. That is not the case for men. Men are constantly making sperm all the time. Men have what are called sperm stem cells, and so they're specialized cells that what they do in life is create more and more and more sperm. And women do not have egg stem cells, and that's why they can't make more eggs after birth. So men will make about 1,500 sperm cells per second. So every second that you're sitting there, you are a factory making a lot of sperm, and that is about 130 million sperm cells per day. Now, it takes about 60 days to make one sperm cell. So what this means is that sperm is being made in cycles. So Men don't have a menstrual cycle, but they have a sperm production cycle. And so what this means is that there is constantly sperm at every stage of growth or development, so that if something were to happen and production stopped right here, that if everything was at the same stage of production and everything stopped at one point in time, then that means it would take 60 days to start up again. And so that means that men would not be consistently fertile. So we have a continuous cycle production. And then, as I said, the testes are housed outside of the body cavity, and that is because in order for sperm to be produced, it has to occur at about 5 degrees colder than body temperature. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but if a guy has a really high fever and is sick for a long period of time, this can actually impact sperm production, and that would result in impaired fertility 60 days later. So that's a little interesting in my mind. So this is that testosterone cycle that I said goes throughout the day. So it's got fluctuations throughout the day, not cyclic across the month like women. Testosterone regulates bone and muscle mass, fat distribution, facial and body hair, sex drive, and sperm production. And then it also affects energy, cognition, and aggression. And so what's really interesting, we hear a lot about how testosterone makes guys aggressive. Well, what we know from studies is that supplementation at high levels of testosterone, that's what's associated with negative aggression and behavior. But normal levels of testosterone are what are associated with positive aggression or vigor, energy, stamina, endurance, those types of things. So just like we talked about with women, that there's a part of male reproduction that may be impacted by health, and that we could use that as an indicator of male health. So sperm number and morphology, so the shape of the sperm, can all be impacted by these factors listed here. So cardiovascular disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, high cholesterol, environmental exposures such as smoking or living in smoggy conditions. All of these things can impact the actual shape and function of the sperm and its ability to actually fertilize an egg. So things about the actual semen or ejaculate, this is actually indicative of health of the man as well. So changes in that in terms of its consistency or volume can be indicative of infection or disease or even infertility. And then we've very recently started to realize that male infertility is associated with an increased risk of testicular and prostate cancer. Not necessarily that one causes the other, but they're correlated with each other. So, and other things that male infertility is correlated with is hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. And so what this means is that we're starting to determine if we can look at these things that are indicators of male fertility as a biomarker for identifying other diseases that those men are at risk for. All right, so I am getting really close. I'm not going to run through this because there's a really cool video. Where do babies come from? So we have male, we have female. We're going to put it together and see how we get babies. So historically, hundreds of years ago, it was thought that the sperm contained an entire tiny human inside of it, and it was called the homunculus. And it was then thought that that entire tiny human, when it entered into the uterus, that the uterus just provided the space and nutrients for that little tiny man to grow. We now know that that's not the case. We actually have, we know that there is both the complement from the sperm and the egg that must come together, contributing both sets of DNA to actually create a new tiny human. So what we're looking at here, I had a video, we don't have time for it. I have a different one that I want you guys to see. So what we have is when the sperm enters the vagina, it's going to be transported through the cervix. Again, that mucus is either going to help it or prohibit it. And then it's going to be transported through muscular contractions by the uterus into the fallopian tube, where it will encounter the egg that has been ovulated from the follicle. The sperm will fertilize the egg in the fallopian tube. It will then develop into an embryo. It will be transported out of the fallopian tube into the uterus, and then it will implant into the uterus. So we are actually going to watch a video. This is called the Zinc Spark of Life. So this was originally studied in mice, and this has been shown in other species as well. What they determined is they were able to see a spark of zinc that occurs after an egg is fertilized. So this shows us within minutes after fertilization the activation of the egg and that initial beginning of that embryo life. So let me start this video. Well, maybe. I apologize, guys. There it is. All right, so you're gonna watch the green, there's the spark. So that is indicating when fertilization has occurred and we now have the coming together of the sperm and egg DNA. So the next slide, well, we'll watch it again on this one. So there's that spark. And then we have just another version of this where it's in black and white, so you can see that spark a little better, maybe. Okay, this one takes a few. So this is actually giving us more of the time that it takes after fertilization before we see that spark. And there it is. So about 3 minutes after fertilization, that spark occurs. Okay, so very last thing. As I said, after fertilization, that embryo is going to grow a little bit in the fallopian tube, and then it's going to move down into the uterus. And the embryo is actually going to contact the uterus, and that's the first contact between the baby and the mom, and that's the first signal that embryo gives to the maternal uterus that it's present there and to maintain its pregnancy. And that embryo will actually embed into the uterus and will send cells into the uterus, and we actually know now that those cells actually end up in the woman's circulation and are retained for many, many years after that child has been born. So at this time of the embryo attaching to the mom's uterus, it produces a hormone called HCG, and that's actually what we detect in pregnancy tests. And that is the hormone signal that the embryo gives to the uterus that says, I'm here, keep me. So it will maintain that uterine lining and cervical structure and everything else that will support the pregnancy. All right, so I went a little longer than I wanted to. I wanted to give more time for questions, but I'm happy to stay longer. Our next Genius of the Body series or seminar is going to be on November 14th. We're still working out the details, but we're putting together a panel discussion of people who have gone on fertility or gynecologic care journeys using alternative methods to hormonal contraceptives. So there'll be more info to come on that. And I would like to thank you for your attention. If you would be so kind, this is a QR code for a women's health clinic survey that we are gaining feedback on, basically whether or not a women's health clinic would be a needed or wanted clinic in the Columbia, Missouri area. So please take that survey and give us your feedback on what you feel about a women's health clinic. And thank you very much for your time.
And I'm happy to take any questions. If you don't want to ask them out loud, you can ask them privately to me, whatever, I'm happy to take. Yes. Mhm. Mhm.
How about pregnancy?
Yeah.
All females, does that occur even if you're not pregnant? You guys feel like you get that memory loss during your menstrual cycle?
So I would,
Only-
so I would say that there's probably, it's going to be very woman dependent. Some women are going to experience more effects of that progesterone than others. So yes, some women will experience the quote unquote, what we call pregnancy brain. So issues with memory for a short period of time. Some women don't at all. And some women don't necessarily experience the pregnancy brain either. So thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Towards the end there, you said that, like after the egg embeds in the uterus,
Mhm.
that there some cells from the egg
Mhm.
kind of become part of the woman's body almost.
Yep.
Hang out in there for a while. So even after birth,
Mhm.
she's carrying about herself. The mom is still carrying parts of or like cells
Yep.
from the child.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. So those, as that embryo is embedding into the uterus, there's cells that will actually, they actually go into the maternal vessels in the uterus. The uterus has a lot of blood vessels, and those embryo cells will go into the maternal blood vessels, and they actually become part of those vessels during pregnancy. And then some of them will actually get into the circulation and will go throughout the woman's body and be retained for a period of time. So yeah, it's pretty cool. We don't really know what they do exactly. There's a lot of thoughts out there, but it's pretty interesting that they're there. Probably some reason. One in the back here? Yes.
Side effects
Mhm.
as well as several other things.
Mhm.
Do those side effects, like if someone is, decides to like stop taking birth control,
Mhm.
how long do those side effects persist after? Or do they, what is the,
Right. So it's going to be, so some of the more prominent side effects that we think about of like, bloating, constipation, those immediate side effects, those are going to resolve pretty quickly. If we're thinking about cancer, so the one of the issues with understanding the relationship between hormones in general and cancer, and then hormonal contraceptives and cancer, is that hormones, so estrogen, for example, works differently in breast tissue than it does in uterine tissue. And so it's going to have different effects. And then we're also going to have to take into consideration if there's an underlying genetic predisposition for a particular cancer, that taking that contraceptive could exacerbate that underlying condition. On the flip side, if it's in that more protective sense, then women who have an underlying predisposition for cancer, then that hormonal contraceptive in that case would be protective. But it's not a case of when you stop it that those effects necessarily stop, because really we don't understand what those effects are. It's an association, if that helps. So some of them they'll resolve right away. The association ones, it's really just, we don't know cause and effect there. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Yes.
on the like,
Mhm.
of the health
Mhm.
vital signs, and how recent is that research?
So this one, the one that I had that picture of, I believe that was from 2022 or 23. So that is a very recent one. How long have we been thinking about it? Maybe, probably for a long time, but actually talking about it maybe in the last 5 years, 5 to 7 years. Yes.
Mentioned that the males produce somewhere around 130 million
Mhm.
a day.
Yep. Ejaculated. So most of them, so they're stored in the epididymis, and if they're not released, then most of them will just get reabsorbed by the body. So there are mechanisms to break them down and degrade them, and then they get replaced with new stored sperm. So it's kind of a replenishment. All right, well, oh, did we have one more? Yes. Yes, please.
Given that the cervix is supposed to be a barrier,
Mhm.
are women that have a higher chance for infection?
Mhm. That is a great question. Um, so presumably they would be at a greater risk for an infection to be able to ascend. So if if you were exposed to something, then you would have a greater chance of it actually ascending into the uterus. But the weird thing is actually when women are under their progesterone dominant state, and particularly in pregnancy, progesterone really modulates your immune system. And so women can actually become a little more susceptible to infection on the other side of things because of how progesterone acts. So maybe easier access, but then difference in immune function. So, yes.
Some birds stop bleeding altogether.
Mhm.
Then what happens to like whatever, because that's like the menstrual cycle, like they cleaning itself out. So like what happens to whatever, how does that work?
Right, right.
Yeah.
So what happens in those, the ones where there's no bleeding is basically you're preventing that massive growth of the endometrium. So it's staying really small. And so you're really only, actually, let me take one step back. Endometrium, when shedding happens during menstruation, it's only the upper 2/3. So when a woman is on a pill or implant or whatever that stops menstruation, it keeps the uterus or the endometrium at that low level before it regrows. And so there's not anything really to menstruate. Um, so that's how you kind of don't have a ton of buildup just hanging out there. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some growth that happens because there's breakthrough bleeding, there's spotting, and then the ones where there's a drop in progesterone, there will be menstruation, but it's usually lighter and shorter. So we don't really know what happens to that tissue, and if there doesn't seem to be any like correlation with like tissue hanging out and becoming necrotic and diseased. I haven't seen that, but it does seem weird to me.
So that's the same with it.
Right, so the uterus is, the endometrium is just going to be maintained and we call it atrophic. So basically it hasn't grown. And so same thing with athletes, it's just that really small endometrial tissue. All right, well, thank you guys for your questions. Again, I'm happy to, oh, did we go till 8? Why didn't someone tell me we go till 8? Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm happy to continue answering plenty more questions since we go till 8. Or if you guys are tired, that's fine too. Oh man, I can't believe, yes, question, in the back and then you. Thank you. Oh no. Oh, we do have handouts. Thank you for letting us know that. Question.
Sociological sense, I don't know, but I've heard on a couple of different podcasts about that's what's the right?
Mhm.
But the idea that like when a woman is on birth control, it could affect the types of men that they're attracted to.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Do you think that's true? Or?
So to be honest, I haven't read those studies in detail, so I'll just give you kind of my educated guess or opinion on that. We do know that lots of hormones in our body, not just sex hormones, which is what we talked about today, impact our pheromone perception system, if you will. And so the idea behind the women taking contraception and then being attracted to different men has to do with the idea that those hormones are impacting their pheromone receptive systems such that the pheromones from different men are received differently. And so then when they stop the contraception, they may be receiving those pheromones differently and so have a positive or negative perception of them. So that's what I know about it. But I've been asked that before, so I feel like I need to actually really dig into that and give you guys some more educated answers.
Side note to that.
Mhm.
Watch the TV. I've heard that actually is very different.
Oh, with pheromone, which makes sense because, so like in estrogen dominant phase, you know, it affects, just your mood and perception in general. So a lot of, brain and cognitive and receptive, aspects. So I'm not surprised that it would be affecting our reception of pheromones as well. Yeah. Oh. What are the causes? Okay, so like a natural miscarriage. There are lots of causes. One of the most straightforward causes, can be that there is not enough progesterone produced by the corpus luteum. And so in that case, women would receive progesterone supplements, to maintain that pregnancy. In other cases, you can have miscarriage due to abnormalities with the embryo development. So if the embryo develops aneuploidy, which is an abnormal number of chromosomes, so like trisomy 13 is a common aneuploidy. A lot of, and that's where Down syndrome comes from. A lot of embryos that have trisomy 13 don't survive, and that would be a miscarriage. So there's other aspects of the uterus, so if the embryo isn't how the cells invade and it remodels the mother's blood vessels, if that doesn't happen properly, you can have a miscarriage, because then the placenta won't form correctly. So those are a couple ways in which miscarriages can happen.
I have an update on the form.
Okay,
So I think this is the QR code to the first survey.
did I put the same one on there twice? Oh,
So
oh,
if you are in state news fam, I'm gonna put it in that, and if not.
okay, thank you, Angel. Other thoughts or questions or things you heard about? All right. Oh, we got another one.
I just think you mentioned that,
Mhm.
in 2017,
Mhm.
had acts of menstrual cycle,
Mhm.
and I was curious if they know the explanation for that or know anything behind it, and
Mhm.
if so, if that's found in the course of the menstruation.
That's a good question. So I didn't turn this on for the people on Zoom. So I'll just repeat that question. It was with the COVID-19 vaccine and effects on menstruation. One is, do we know if other vaccines have a similar effect? And do we know what the COVID-19 vaccine did that affected menstruation? So, that is still a current topic of research. But what is known so far is that vaccines, what they do is they cause an immune reaction in your body so that you develop antibodies to a virus, for example. So menstruation, I didn't go into this because it's a whole big area, is actually a process that involves the immune system, and it's actually an inflammatory process. It's a wound healing process. So shedding and just like when you cut your skin, there's a wound healing process. Same thing happens to the uterus after menstruation. So the inflammatory system is involved. So the thought is that with the COVID-19 vaccine, it caused such a high inflammatory reaction that it actually, if it was taken, it depended on if it was taken near the timing of when menstruation is going to happen, it actually increased that inflammatory response. And so there was heavier menstruation. That's the most common outcome that was seen is heavier menstruation. So that's what we know so far. And there are researchers who are looking into using the COVID-19 vaccine as an example for why we actually need to look at other vaccines as well. And so they are looking into other common vaccines to see if they have any sort of effect. Yes.
So with like an undergrown or maybe halted growth of the endometrial lining
Mhm.
being an issue more so as it's simply just like a symptom of a larger health issue.
Mhm.
Just taking that cycle, just the growth and then shedding,
Mhm.
does that process have any, like tangentially have any other beneficial health effects?
Oh, the actual process
Yeah,
of
just the process
menstruation?
itself, does that affect anything else in the body?
That's a good question. Not that I know of, but I will tell you something interesting. There was a study done in mice, so take it for what you will. Where they showed that, so a lot of gynecological diseases, the cure is hysterectomy. So uterine fibroids, adenomyosis, endometriosis sometimes, but a lot of times it's hysterectomy. And so the thought is it's not a big deal, right? The uterus, it's not the ovaries, which produce hormones. We know those hormones impact all kinds of other things in our body, right? But they did this study and they showed that when mice had just their uterus removed versus their uterus and ovaries, and they did cognitive tests on them, that even mice that had just their uterus removed, they had cognitive impairment. So suggesting that there's some sort of interaction between the uterus and the brain. I don't know more beyond that. So to the menstruation, it could be, who knows? I will say that there are a lot of, local things that are produced that probably get into the systemic circulation, and have impacts elsewhere. I don't think it's been studied. Yes.
Can cancer spread from the reproductive system to the rest of the body?
Yes.
And how do you like know that you have it? Cause I don't know, I know someone in my life that like found out that they had it and then had to get stuff removed.
Mhm.
So,
So it depends on the cancer. So if it is uterine cancer, or endometrial cancer, that is typically affects, older women. It probably, we don't understand really how early it starts and the progression, but we typically find it in older women. And it is usually diagnosed because, women are experiencing, postmenopausal bleeding. That's the biggest sign of endometrial cancer. So now, when it comes to, say, ovarian cancer, that impacts women of various ages, but it's actually super hard to diagnose. So that one doesn't have the typical gynecological symptoms that we think of with endometrial cancer or even uterine fibroids or endometriosis. Those have different symptoms, and usually those are due to metastasis. So ovarian cancer is typically diagnosed late stage, and it's diagnosed because of the spread of the cancer to other areas. And so it's identified because of other symptoms, not anything associated with the reproductive system. Breast cancer is going to be, if you're feeling lumps, things like that. Cervical cancer, that is usually, has thankfully been reduced the incidence a lot due to cancer screening and testing for HPV, which is one of the big causes of cervical cancer. So that is typically diagnosed or detected early with pap smears. So they'll identify abnormal cells from the pap smear, and then they'll determine the level of abnormality that they're seeing in those cells, and then go from there as to whether or not further screening. That answers some of your.
so if you remove like some parts of you,
Mhm.
does that like take away the cancer fully then, or?
So if it's local, so uterine cancer, does not spread. Well, it doesn't typically spread as much as ovarian cancer, but that's probably because we actually detect uterine cancer earlier than ovarian cancer, so we catch it before it spreads. So in that case, if it's only local to the uterus and you remove the uterus, then presumably you've removed the cancer and the woman would be fine. The problem is because we don't understand how early cancers develop and we don't understand how early they start to spread. There can be metastatic cells, so cells that have traveled throughout the body that haven't formed tumors yet. And so then you remove the ovary. It wasn't known that those cells had already metastasized. And so then a tumor can form later in a secondary site, even though the primary organ was already removed. So it just depends on when it's caught, if removing the organ or tissue will cure the cancer. Yes.
So you mentioned earlier, we were talking about like prostate cancer, for example. What can men do to lower their risks or chances of having that cancer?
Oh, well, so what I will say, is prostate cancer is not as big of a risk as another thing that I didn't mention, which is benign prostatic hypertrophy or BPH. That's actually super common. I think the rate is like men over the age of 70, it's not 90% of them will get benign prostatic hypertrophy. So that one, thankfully, there's a surgery that can be done to treat that. For prostate, so I bring this up because there's always been this question, does BPH become prostate cancer? And it's not known. So what I would say is, if there is an association between BPH and prostate cancer, then making sure that you're getting regular screening at the appropriate time. It really isn't those two diseases affect men of older age. And really it's thought to do to actually uncontrolled estrogen activity on the prostate, which is usually due to an enzyme that causes testosterone, which is normally to be produced, to be converted into estrogen, and then it can have these negative effects on the prostate, which may lead to prostate cancer. That's not a direct cause and effect, but it's associated. And so it would be monitoring at the time, I think it's at age 40, men should start getting regular prostate exams. And so keeping an eye on the development of BPH, monitoring for symptoms of BPH. Usually one of the first symptoms is issues with urination, frequent urination. And so if you can monitor that and catch that early and have that addressed, then your chances of, if there is a development into prostate cancer, would be reduced. Yes. So that is a complex process. So I'll try and make it straightforward. What happens after pregnancy is women typically enter what's called an anovulatory state. So they're not ovulating. And if the ovary is not making those follicles and the corpus luteum, they're not making the hormones, and then the uterus isn't changing, and so they're not menstruating. So it's anovulation and no menstruation. That is typically due to lactation. So women who don't breastfeed are not typically going to experience postpartum anovulation. So what happens after a period of time is usually you will have, so your uterus actually repairs quite quickly. Within 40 to 60 days after pregnancy, the uterus is fully back to normal and could receive another embryo if it were there. Now, is the woman ovulating at this point in time and cycling? Depends on if she's breastfeeding or not. So if she's breastfeeding, it shuts down that cycle or that hormone signaling process up at the brain. And so she won't ovulate and won't menstruate. If she's not breastfeeding or she starts to reduce breastfeeding, then you stop that negative feedback from the nursing onto the brain. And so the cycle will start to start up again. But it's not an immediate like, bam, cycle's normal. It's a, and we don't really understand, but kind of a gearing up and ramping back in, kind of getting back to normal. So it's not an immediate process. That help? Okay.
Just wanted to share, if people do need to leave, we have a kind of a lot of pamphlets right here, about just different podcasts and hormones and doctors that might be willing to support you in some of these kinds of things. And so I just wanted to share with you.
Yes, and please feel free to leave if you need to. And please keep asking questions if you want to.
I would just make a really strong encouragement to, when we get those right to our folks, to test their
Yes.
And you mentioned that comparison about an eighth of a teaspoon of sugar,
Mhm.
in an Olympic-sized swimming pool.
Mhm.
Can you give any kind of a sense of like how much does the like the pill
Oh,
relate
um,
correspondingly?
let me think. I was just actually looking at a pill, at some dosages when I was preparing for this. I remember, I'm gonna go with micrograms. So I'm gonna be conservative on my estimate here. If it's I would say anywhere from 10 to 100-fold higher concentration, depending on, so gosh, actually, no, it's gonna be, so we're, the highest hormone concentration in women is 200 picograms per mil. And over-the-counter birth control, if I'm being conservative, is going to either be in the microgram or milligram range, which is pico, nano, micro. Yeah, it's a lot high. It's like anywhere from 3 to 6 zeros more. Depending. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And the point being is to override endogenous hormones so that you're basically shutting down. You're keeping everything in a inactive state, basically. So you have to put a lot to override all of that. Some of them are less, some are more. Yes.
Said these synthetic hormones you're getting in the water supply, are they easily able to be filtered out, or is there simply maybe just not the knowledge or professional to do that?
Right. So yes, some of it can be filtered out. Actually, if you Google it, there's like companies that actually sell filtration systems that are supposed to help filter out these hormones. I couldn't speak to whether or not, like our municipal water systems are filtering out these hormones. I don't know to that level. What I will say is, there is the technology out there to filter them out. Whether or not it is used, I don't know. And I think if it's not used, it's probably because, honestly, I don't think that studies were done until, more recent time to actually look and see if there are these specifically, not just, so there's 20 different kinds of estrogens, natural estrogens, and then we have synthetic estrogens. And so you have to be able to have the test that will detect the estrogen that you're looking for. And so it took time for those tests to be able to be developed to detect the specific estrogens that are in hormonal contraceptives, so that we can actually do the test to say, yes, it is present in the water. Now, what do we do about it? Can we filter it out? Or can we reduce putting it in there in the first place? Other questions? Okay, well, I will thank you all again. It was very great to have you here. Your questions were awesome and thank you. And if you have any final questions that you don't want to ask out loud, just please let me know. I'll hang around for a couple minutes. So thank you again.
The correct survey is in the several groupies, the Catholic Medical Association group me, the Noon Fam group me, the campus ministry group me. If you're not in any of those, that's okay. Come see me and I will give it to you.